right, thank you everyone. I'll try to speak into the microphone here. So, let's see, there we are. So I wanted to start out, thank you, with our conservation plan. So that's what kind of drives the sustainability program and the water conservation program. Lorenzo's here too, so I wanted to give him a shout out too, just because I see him out there. But the main target here is to reach 175 gallons per capita daily. So I'm going to talk about why that might be a little bit challenging for us. And as of 2023, you can see we're at 193 per capita daily, so a little bit of work to do there. This is kind of where we are, and then you can see those other regional areas. You see how they have different goals that they're supposed to reach, and someone else can explain better why that was determined, but you see where we sit on that. And then a little bit of solutions, like how we're going to approach that. A really big one is capital improvement projects, so main replacement, things like that. These are leaks that are occurring on a really old infrastructure, and that's the kind of thing that really adds up over time. I mean, these leaks vary, and you imagine miles of pipeline, how much that can build up to. And something I'm very thankful for, and I know the residents are as well, is expeditious leak repair. So you'll see our crews out there. If you drive around Ogden a lot, chances are you've seen them digging up the road, replacing a pipe or patching a pipe, and getting on that right away. Like they don't let stuff sit and leak for days and days once it surfaces. So I'm very thankful for that, and that has a big impact. End user leak identification and notification. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but this is actually the customer, is what we call the water user. You could also say the resident or business that uses water, and I'll talk about that on another slide. Then public outreach and education, that can come in several different forms that I'll talk about. And one that you might not always hear about with water conservation is cross-connection control and backflow prevention. And two really big reasons that's important. The first is obviously public health. You know, we don't want to contaminate the water supply. The second is if that event should occur, we're talking a huge amount of flushing that would occur. So that's a ton of water that would have to just be dumped essentially to flush out either an area or the whole system, depending on how severe that is. And you've probably read about that in the news at some point. You've seen what can happen there. So that is something that's really important too. And this is our annual water usage goal. So this is a projection that was put together for us. And you see, I mean, you can kind of understand as the population's growing, you see how we're kind of trying to curb that overall consumption. So therein lies some of the challenge with that. And I'm just going to go to another graph. This graph shows the amount of connections that we have, and we break our classes up into residential, commercial, industrial, institutional. So you can see the majority is residential. In our case, that also includes apartments. So that would still be classified as residential in this case. But the next graph will show you something interesting. So you see residential actually is using the most water, but if you were to look at either commercial or industrial, actually any of those really, you see there's much fewer connections, but the amount of water that those connections use is really big, relatively speaking, to how many connections there are. So where that creates a challenge, which we like to call challenges opportunities, because it gives us a chance to figure out how to fix it or accommodate it. But where that's tricky is we're talking per capita water use, and if we have big industry using a ton of water, that can kind of skew that a little bit, where we have to try even harder to conserve water. And then this is the software program I use. This was formerly called WaterSmart. Now it's called VX Smart. And it has been just a huge benefit for the end user. I mean, this is something every morning I come in, the first thing I do is I open up this program, and I can see probably next day, like something that happened a day ago, I can see if there's a big leak that's occurring. We call that a continuous consumption event. We don't call that a leak because it might not necessarily be a leak. It might just be something got left turned on, so we wouldn't call that a leak. But for the sake of this presentation, you can just assume it's a leak. And you can see on here I've blocked out the addresses, obviously, for privacy reasons, but you can see those flow rates on there. And what's really beneficial about this program is it can sort that data, so I can go from the really, really big stuff down to the really small leaks, and obviously giving priority to the really big stuff. And this has just been huge. This has been a really big benefit. And the users can actually sign up and they can view this data. And where that really helps them is, say they're out of town on vacation or something like that. It seems like that's always when someone's service line blows up in their basement or something happens. We've seen that quite a few times. It's always when they're on vacation, it seems. So, or they flush the toilet before they leave for the airport, and then their toilet gets hung up, and I see that quite a few times too. So anyway, what I'll do with this data is I'll actually go out to the property, to the connection, and I'll inspect the meter and then get a hold of the owner and try to resolve the problem, and I'll help them try to locate the source of the continuous use. And then now we're looking at the data, how it reads out. So you'll see this is a hourly breakdown here, or this is daily breakdown here. And I don't know who can tell what the pattern is that they're seeing there, but I'll just tell you that would be sprinkler use. When you see this pattern that's occurring, that's the sprinklers. And we'll break into another one here. So this is actually going into hourly here. So you can see when the sprinklers occur. You can see what time it occurred. I know this seems a little Big Brother-esque. I've heard someone use that term earlier today, but we only use it for good intention. And you can see how there's a big jump right there. So I would, if I see something like that, I'm assuming that's a burst leak, or that's something that just blew up. And in this case, went out to the property, and this was just a little, this is a fairly small puddle that was surfacing. This is a car lot, and you can actually see, if you're familiar with how leaks kind of manifest, you can see all the little sediment coming up to the top. And that was actually, it was over 20 gallons a minute that was doing. So that was actually a really big service line leak that was occurring there. And then this is another pretty typical pattern that you would see. And this is a leak that may have started out as a small pinhole. And over time, that water will actually bore out the pipe material. And that leak is going to progressively increase. So it's going to get bigger and bigger each day. Where this can be a little tricky, if no one's looking at the data like this, like if we're not getting good meter data, the owner might not totally notice an increase on their bill, because it might be gradual when you're billed per 1,000 gallons. But eventually it can become something. It doesn't always go nice and linear. It might, if it's blowing a thread out or something, it might just blow up really big. Like it might start like this, and then it just kind of exponentially grows up like that. So in that case, this one, go out there, open up the meter vault, and there's, got sprayed in the face pretty good. And then this one you can see was burnt out the threads on the meter set like that. So this is one without that program, without seeing that, there just wouldn't be a way to really notice that. It'd be similar to a service line leak that doesn't surface. You just really wouldn't have much to go off of if you didn't have that. You'd be waiting for the monthly bill, and at that point, this may have been caught within a couple days, but if you're waiting for the end of the month, you might be paying another 29 days depending on when your last bill was. So it's just a huge both water savings, and it benefits the customer because it's saving them money. And then I just put up some other examples of leaks that I find. So very common, anything landscape related, it's really common. The valve box is full of water. That might not be noticed right away. I've seen where lawn services will drive their mower right over a just massive soft spot, and they won't really say anything about it. They'll just keep going. But usually these do manifest because your irrigation lines aren't super deep. But I'll talk about one that doesn't manifest, and that's your stop and waste valve. So stop and waste valve, if you don't know, that's your main sprinkler valve if you're on culinary water. And if that valve's not fully shut or fully open, it lets water both go in and then out of the orifice that you see on there. So that's why it's a stop and waste. So it'll stop the flow, and then it'll drain out everything that's inside of the system. So again, if it's just a little bit off from being fully open or fully shut, it's just gonna let water run through there, and you're not gonna see that because this is probably sitting 4 feet down or so. So you're not gonna see it. Eventually they'll usually fill up the little access tube, but very, very common. I think last week I had 2 of these that I found. So that's a very common thing to see. The most common though is the toilet, the running toilet. So as you can probably imagine, what's kind of hard for some to believe is how much water that can actually flow, because they usually don't. It seems like it's just barely moving. But if it's wide open, I've seen them do 6 gallons a minute, just like flappers folded over. I'll just share the story. I don't know how much time I have. So one house I went to, it had 12 gallons a minute that had occurred sometime in the middle of the night. It just started going 12 gallons a minute. And I went out there, and both toilets' flapper valves were fully wrapped up in the chain. And that was probably one of the stranger ones I've seen. Water softeners pretty often. The water softener will get stuck in its regen mode, and they're, a gallon and a half, 3 gallons a minute usually is where I see those. And those are piped just down the drain usually, so you don't see it doing anything. Another thing to note on both of these in the toilets is that high frequency that they make, like that hissing sound. As you age, you can't hear that sound as easily. So it can be to the point where it's going, but you don't hear it. So you can't tell it's going. This is an interesting one. I don't know if you can see. I'm going to try to use this. So right there, this is a water heater, and the temperature pressure relief valve was blown open, and it was just blasting in there. So that was a pretty interesting one again. Another thing I offer is water audits, so outdoor sprinkler checks, and you can see kind of the few main tests done there: the catch cup, the soil core, and then a pressure check. What we're shooting for, if you're doing a system, is head-to-head coverage. That's kind of the key to efficient irrigation, and that means each head is landing at its neighboring head. They don't meet in the middle. They have to get that full coverage. I don't know if I can go back. So with the catch cup test, that's testing a couple things. It's testing distribution uniformity, and the way to imagine that is see the cups in a grid. So if they were all the exact same amount of water in every single cup, that would be 100% DU, distribution uniformity. Typically what I'll see is, well, I don't know about typical, but if we're hitting like 60%, that's fairly acceptable. Often I'll see like 30% or 20%. And the problem with that is the way the audit works is it'll shoot for a ½ inch of water. Like, how long would it take you to do a ½ inch of water? So I've had houses where if we just go off that audit, I'm going to tell them to run their sprinkler for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and that's way overkill. And it's because some areas are flooding and some areas are hardly getting anything at all. So you got to take that data and then realize if there's a problem with it. If that distribution uniformity is super low, you can't just say, well, you got to water that long. Then I would look for solutions on what they could change with it. I guess I didn't put more soil. The soil core, that can be very, very enlightening, because if you have any kind of loam or any kind of clay constituent in there, it'll hold on to water. It'll have a water holding capacity. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard the recommendation of a ½ inch of water per irrigation, or similarly, like doing less days of the week watering. The only problem is if you had like a really sandy soil, it's not going to hold on to water. So you're not going to be able to abide by that. One, you're not going to want to do a ½ inch of water because it's just going to go right through. And then two is you actually do have to irrigate more often just because it's not going to hold on to water. So if you think about it like total water used, if you water for less time and then you water more often, you could end up using the same amount of water, but you're using it more efficiently if you have a sandy soil. And I've seen very different soil types within the same yard, so it can be pretty challenging just trying to dial that in. And often people have an issue with maybe just one part of their yard, and I'll do a soil core and we'll see, oh, that's got sand, so that's why that's a tough part. Let's go back. That's an example of high pressure. So you see how the water's misting quite a bit, like it just looks like a big cloud of water. And the problem with that is if you have any kind of wind going on, that's just going to take all your water and put it in the neighbor's house. So that would be that example of high pressure. And then this is just me doing a soil ribbon to see kind of what the makeup is of that soil. And then I'm also looking at the root depth with that to see how deep the roots are, and that can be an indicator too of what kind of watering is going on. Something else I do is water violations. This is kind of the bad cop thing here. So you can see like one of the major ones is broken sprinklers, and you see some examples there. There's a drive-through car wash that's occurring. You'll see it just going down the gutter, and that's the state bird, so that might be benefiting something at least. What I want to bring up with that one is that's a drip irrigation system, and drip can be tricky because that had been going on for several days, and you don't notice it like you notice a spray head because that's very obvious. The drip is just slowly saturating that whole area, and what usually causes that is just a zone valve stuck on. That's all that is. But yeah, you see, until it's actually making a big mess in the parking lot, you don't totally notice that. And then winter time. So winter plus sprinklers, if they're not properly winterized, I've got some examples of what can happen. So this can actually create a huge public safety issue because it'll ice up a whole sidewalk. You imagine the overspray that you'll see on sprinklers normally. When that's occurring in the wintertime, it produces a new hazard that way. And usually what will happen here is the system wasn't shut off, the zone valve will freeze, and then when it does that, it'll bypass the diaphragm in the zone valve, and then it just starts running. This is kind of a fun one. So you can see like the sprinklers were actually running and made some cool ice crystals on the tree there, but that's just another example of that. And then this can be very costly, so that's a backflow preventer right there. It's the RP. So It just wasn't winterized, and when that happens, it'll expand and crack it like that. What's very common is for those valves to crack too if they're not positioned correctly. So just making sure everything's drained out. And there's just another one. So these are, just kind of fun to look at. But this is another one that was just not winterized, and it's just able to freeze. This one's pretty common. So that's a freeze-proof sillcock on the side of the house. So that's a hose bib that actually has a long stem that goes through the wall, and it actually shuts off inside of the house. That's how it doesn't freeze, is it'll shut off in there, and it'll drain out. But when you have something hooked up to it, like in that case, they put that Y on there, and it's either valved off or it's got a sprinkler controller like that. So it's essentially keeping that water up in there so it can't drain out. When that freezes, it'll actually break inside of the wall of the house on that length of pipe that's inside, and then it's just blasting inside of the house. So I've seen that several times. And then something interesting that Ogden has is canal irrigation. We don't provide it, but it's just Ogden City. There's people who have canals that water their lawn. So it'll actually flood irrigate. And as you can imagine, we get quite a few calls when that happens because people think a main breaks. And we still have to respond to it because it's possible a main did break, but often it'll just be the canal irrigation is going on, and they'll have their yard flooded like that. These are a few incentives we offer. So we give out indoor conservation kits, soil moisture meters, and we just started the Flip Your Strip program. So that's something kind of new to us. And here's an example of, these are all projects that were done in Ogden. So these are all Flip Your Strip applicants, and just give you some examples of what they do. Often they'll do their front yard too. We don't do the full-on landscape lawn exchange program yet, but sometimes they'll take the initiative. They'll do their strip, and then they'll take the initiative to do their front yard too. And just some public outreach and education. So on the left side of the screen, you see that's what I'll set up at like the Nature Center or Weber Basin's Garden Fair. It's just some home water use information. And then on the right side, that is a water model that we had made as an artist down in Arizona, actually carved that out of foam. And that is showing the Ogden Weber River watershed. So you can dump water on it. You can, kind of show what's happening. And this goes to the Weber County Water Fair, and it's a really cool thing to show the kids because you can explain pretty much everything about how the water system works, including talking about snow and how the snow acts as a reservoir in itself, like the release of the snow when it melts. And then I'll also talk to them about where does the water go when you flush the toilet or when you use the sink, and I'll talk to them about how it goes to the Central Weber Sewer Improvement District, and that's always fun for them to imagine. But it gives them the idea of where does my water come from, where does it go. It's just a really cool way to show that. And then this is at the USU Botanical Gardens in Ogden. So we've got a little section that's showing some water efficient plants, and that's just kind of fun to look at. And that's all I got. Thank you. Questions? Someone's got to have one. No, I never got that. That's still a mystery. The question for the recording was if I ever got a story behind the two flapper valves that were simultaneously, they were intertwined with chain, like it was wrapped around good. No, I never got the answer on that. So Other questions?
Do you know how much that one software analytics program costs Ogden City every year?
I can't give you an updated cost because I don't know, but you can reach out to us and we can get that for you. The question was how much does the VX Smart program cost, and it also depends on how many connections you're monitoring on it. So yeah, but VX Smart is what it's called. Yeah, and you can reach out to us and ask us about that. We're happy to tell you about it.
Matt, you had that one slide with the water pressure spraying.
Yeah. Oh, with the
What is the normal water pressure we should have in our homes?
So what that was the question was about the pressure gauge on the spray head on the sprinkler. And the question is how much pressure should you have? So that was measuring dynamic pressure. So dynamic pressure is when the system's running versus static pressure would be just when nothing's running at all. So dynamic pressure on that, 20 to 30 PSI on a spray head. Usually you'll keep it from misting. So somewhere in that neighborhood is good. For like your home, the sprinklers come off upstream of where you would have your pressure regulator. So you could be 80 to 100 PSI because you're just street pressure usually on your sprinkler system. Whereas your home by plumbing code has to be under 80 PSI. So your home's going to be like 65 PSI, 50 to 65, somewhere in there. So that's kind of where it is. If you had a rotor head, those will operate at a higher dynamic pressure, so those will be up 60 to 80 or so. They usually will operate at a higher pressure, and they're throwing the water really far. If you had to correct that, unfortunately, it is a big undertaking because you'd have to install a regulator just on your sprinkler main, essentially. You can use the flow control if you have flow control on your zone valves, but it can be tricky to try to get that dialed in where it's not going to, ideally you would regulate the pressure with a regulator. Any other questions? That's it. Thank you.